Right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Q&A session for the Korean story. My name is Hyunjin-an. I'm a TA for the Korean story. Today, we will be with Professor Byoung-Joo Kim again. Could you say hello to us?
Hello. Hi,
Uh,
everyone who's joining us. Thank you very much finding your time to join us here.
Thank you. He will cover Module 5 and 8. Module 5 was divided into two sections, into Module 5A and B. I'm sure you would have had many questions. And now I'm going to start off with the questions from our discussion board first. And you can freely ask on the chat room if you have any questions from Module 5 and 8. So the first question is, during the Semao movement, the government trusted the leaders. In some countries where the leaders are corrupted, it is not possible. How could government know the leaders are trustable enough to follow movement in a right way? It was asked by Toyin Bukolazkia.
Okay, I think that's a very important question. Um, of course, when the lack of trust overall is low nationwide, probably implementing Samuel style initiative would be very challenging and difficult. However, if the overall level of trust is a reasonable level, I think there could be institutional designs and institutional innovations that can be used in order to control this problem. What I have in mind is if government introduces a strong kind of accounting and auditing system to follow the use of this funding or assistance, uh, then I think we could pretty much kind of try to minimize the problem. What I'm saying is if village leaders are required to turn in their accounting records of using these resources together with the acknowledgement from different residents of the village certifying that these records are true with their real name, I think village leaders will have greater incentive to follow the rules and to be firm in principles rather than cheating. So what I'm saying is if there is a stronger structure and system to monitor openly the use of the resources, I think this problem could be possibly minimized. And also, villages can think about introducing an auditor system, their own people actually checking and monitoring the leader's use of it. And maybe we can combine the two, the first idea that I mentioned, together with the auditor idea, so that the auditor could examine and certify the spending records and so on. So I think the institutional designs are always possible to deal with these kind of problems. So that could be perhaps one way to deal with this problem. And by widely practicing this kind of system, maybe overall trust level could be enhanced over time. So this idea that I'm suggesting could be tried, and it may not have immediate benefits, impacts initially, but over time, if it's repeated, I'm thinking it could have certain kind of differences.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's related to your answers for for question one. How could you give us idea how could Korean government was able to see the potential in village leader to participate the movement? It was also asked by the one of the students.
Of course, Korea has a long tradition of having village leaders, and leaders, of course, sometimes there could be corrupt leaders and so on, but often, usually, villages are small communities, so things are rather more open than national level or regional level. So, in Korea's case, in these kind of village systems, these village elders were often reasonably pretty well respected by the members. So, These were important resources for Korean government's mobilization efforts, such as Semarundong, Sema movement, and so on. So I guess traditionally we had those kind of figures in many of the villages, and this policy was designed to take advantage of or utilize such resources. So traditional context has a much of a implication or uh, much of the foundation factor here, I have to admit. And of course, in modern days, when we see the urbanization and growth of large cities, presence and role of this kind of village leaders are more difficult to expect. So there is a limit in terms of using this idea. But still, in many of the countries, in rural villages, I wonder whether this kind of model could still work. But because naturally, in many of these villages of different countries, often they do indeed have their village elders and village leaders naturally selected or supported and often respected by the village members. So, in many parts, if not all, but many parts of the countries around the world, this could be still perhaps a valid and practical idea to try. That's my view.
Okay, thank you. Would you agree that the Tamil movement utilizing the potential of the village leaders was possible at that time, at that moment, or would you agree that it's possible also today's perspective?
It depends which country you're talking about. In Korea, uh, undertaking such kind of village movement may not have as much impact these days, considering the fact that Korea as a country has become much more urbanized since then. So the rural communities are rather limited in terms of their numbers and so on, as compared to the 60s, 70s, and so on, when we tried the such movement. But as I touched on earlier, in many of the developing countries, when you have these rural communities, I guess still that kind of initiative and idea may be workable or at least worth trying. So time-wise, yes, indeed, in the countries where big part of the each country is urbanized and has become cities and so on, this model has limitations. But in other parts, in those particular countries, and in other countries where rural communities are still big in terms of their size, I think this is still a possibly workable model for them as well. That's my view.
Okay, thank you. I will ask another question from Mohaji. He said it is so amazing to see the contribution of the leaders during the movement. How could the village leaders have such mindset in Korea for a long term?
I guess one could argue that from the beginning, maybe the nation was geared toward supporting the cause of national building, perhaps after suffering many difficulties like the Korean War that produces extreme poverty, and before then, Japanese colonialization, and before then, challenges of modernization Korean people faced after uh, centuries of state failure here in Joseon Dynasty period. I guess uh, that's probably historically speaking. I think the leaders could have had greater cause or mindset to follow this kind of national initiative that has rather clear vision and so on. So in that sense, what we realize these days is a articulation of national vision and articulation of the overall direction this particular nation we're talking about, would whichever the case would be, has to take into the future. I think the communication and sharing of this vision is very important. And in that sense, the national leaders' role in generating consensus behind what kind of national vision and sense of direction we will have, and then actively sharing that kind of national vision and sense of direction with the public. I guess that's very, very important. And when such vision and sense of direction is effectively shared, these local leaders and community and rural leaders will have to perhaps join in and then participate in the collective effort for seeking such goals. So I guess in addition to historical background, also the roles and the works of the national leadership probably would make a considerable difference, and that's what we see in Korea's case, the way I see it.
Okay. Since the collectivism and the political perspective was mentioned, I would like to ask a questions regarding the Model 8, which was about the political. Do you think the dictatorship at that time was helpful and somehow and necessary in order to lead the country with driving a collective manner for a development in a short term?
That's a tough question. Depending on how we define dictatorship, if we define dictatorship as a leadership that just acts on its own without people feedback, I don't think that will work anywhere. And we cannot say the political leadership that Park Chung-hee had was, in that sense, that particular kind of dictatorship. Park Chung-hee faced a great pressure to perform and deliver what people wanted at that time. So it was rather responsive leadership before it's a dictatorship. Yes, it was a dictatorship because especially after 1971-72, Koreans could no longer directly elect their own president until Park Chung-hee's passing in 1979, and then Korea's full democratization in 1987. We couldn't do so. Yes, indeed, it was a dictatorship in that regard, but this particular dictatorship was very responsive and very sensitive to the need of the people. So dictatorship of any kind, we cannot say actually will be necessary or even desirable at all. And in Korea, the strong leadership that took a form of dictatorship actually had a high level of responsiveness, and Park Chung himself faced great pressure to deliver the results. And let's keep this in mind. During Park's regime, his reign, 60s, 70s, early 70s, and so on, he was very successful, and people felt that he was making it possible for Korea to live better life every year. We had very high growth rate, almost close to double-digit growth rate every year. So he was performing really well. But when his regime ended, 1979, the economic situation overall got really bad. And so this particular political leadership, we cannot say was immune to the accountability. When Park Chung-hee was no longer able to deliver people the prosperity and high growth, he lost his power. Not only he lost power, actually he was assassinated, and his assassin, the former head of Korea's Central Intelligence, there's indication that this former national security chief or national intelligence firmly believed that Park Chung-hee had lost his base of support in the country. So to get back to your own particular question, whether dictatorship is necessary for mobilization and so on, my answer would be no, clearly no to that question. And what's necessary is a national leadership that actively invites or accept people's desire and people's will, and
Mhm.
and deliver what people need. Uh, that kind of leadership is necessary, but not just a simply defined a political leadership called dictatorship. I don't think it's necessary.
Mm, okay. So, strong and responsive leadership rather than the dictatorship would be more
Right.
important for the
Right.
development.
And in this case, then strong and responsive leadership could easily lead a leader into a longer term in the office, and
Mm,
could call that, perhaps many people would call it dictatorship. In
mhm,
that case, yes, indeed. So am I saying then this kind of strong leadership, even though it could lead to longer term in the office without direct accountability, political accountability to the people, whether it's necessary and desirable, I will not go that far,
mhm,
saying that such leadership will be necessary. All I'm saying is uh, democracy always matters, and what people want needs to be reflected in government policy.
mhm,
So, uh, in the ideal world, I would like to see responsive, responsible, and accountable leadership chosen by the people, and I like to see, once chosen by the people, I like to see those kind of leadership remain accountable and responsive to the people's need, and I like to see them deliver the things that people need, including, and perhaps one of the most important things, economic development and
mhm.
modernization of the society. That's, I guess, my position here.
Okay. We'll go more deep into the political perspective after asking uh, one more questions from Sema movement. Um, so Kukokoma asked, Korean economic story has improvement experience in both urban and rural areas through Sema movement. The key from Sema movement was the rural leadership training and woman empowerment. What do you think is the crucial key to reduce the gap between urban and rural areas in other countries? Could you also explain the Korean's case, maybe possibly?
I guess the answer may be found in the question itself. The student has made a point that Korea actually, Samuel movement was a way to encourage ruler leadership, and have such leadership be active in training human resources and encouraging female participants. That what that means is the Samuel movement itself was paying close attention to, or even we can say focused on, rural development. And so, what better way can we find in terms of closing the gap between urban community and rural communities? Hemal movement was indeed a, not only just a national movement to bring about development and modernization, but also we
Mhm.
could argue that this particular movement was designed to close the gap between the urban community on one hand and then rural community on the other, by
Mm.
focusing on the rural side.
So in the beginning, it was already designed to reduce the gap in Sema movement's case, right?
If you ask the designers of this policy, I don't know whether they will say this policy was designed to close
Mhm.
the gap, but immediately after the industrialization took off, political leader Park and the Korean people noticed that industrialization means action taking place in the rural, urban communities,
Mhm.
and we got to find a way to bring along the rural community together with the national and the nation's movement going forward. So I don't think they will say they were particularly designed to close the gap, but they were
Mhm.
designed to bring along the ruler community together with the nation's movement forward.
Mm. I I think in my perspective, Korean Sema movement was actually uh, very natural, like boosting people's mindset at that time to let's move on and let's move on to the development. Was it possible because of Korea's case?
Yes and no, I guess, and I guess more yes than no here. And the Korean people saw the need for modernization and
Mm-hmm.
development through the historical experience. Before Japan's colonialization, 1910, beginning of 20th century, even from the later part of 19th century, Koreans saw Western powers how strong they were based on industrialization and economic development, while the whole country at that time remained rather rural and agricultural. So they saw that particular gap between Koreans themselves on one hand and then Western powers on the other that succeeded through industrialization and development. So that was some kind of wake up call then at the end of 19th century. And then when Korea was colonialized by uh, like a Western style colonial power, Western style, what I mean by that is an Asian power that tried to follow the West, Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And when Korea was colonialized, then there was another strong wake up call for Koreans that we also one day need to modernize so that we will no longer be ruled by Japan or be subject to the wills of colonial power. So that's a second wake up call during the first part of 20th century. And then the as the time went, and then when Koreans got closer to the mid 20th century, meaning leaving behind decolonialization, liberalization from Japanese rule, uh, we suffered from the Korean War, the Civil War. And there we saw uh, many countries around the world, and especially 16 countries that sent troops and personnel to help South Korea. We saw in them the power of industrialization, modernization. So Korean people were continuously exposed to the external uh, wake up calls. First, colonial power, second, Japan, and third, the Western power that are willing to fight for us in order to keep the prospect for democracy and capitalist economy in place. So through those exposure to the international community and the countries that were doing better than Korea, I think Korean people actually uh, had stimulation, realization that one day it's necessary for Korea to achieve industrialization and industrialization of the economy, development of it, and then also modernization of the entire society and so on. So I think there was a strong awareness in because of this historical context, and this could apply to other developing countries. Developing countries today have seen many good examples of developing their nation, modernizing their nation, and putting together people and country in the same boat and then move forward. And I guess one of the reasons why we are doing this MOOC session here is because Korea has set one of those examples. So in that sense, I think developing countries of our time indeed do have certain reasonably good cases to follow. Korea's case, of course, is not a perfect case. It has many positive sides, but it also has considerable negative sides as well. So when we look into so-called success cases, we have to be very mindful, simultaneously be aware of the plus side of this particular country's achievement, as well as the shortcomings this particular country of your interest have produced as failures and so on. So I think such balanced approach will be absolutely critical in this regard.
Thank you. Enlightened people and the design of the policy come together, had a
Right,
Sema movement. That's very
right.
interesting insight, Professor. We got one question from Barbara. She asked, could a movement such as the Sema movement be led by private foundations as opposed to government?
I guess increasingly for the past several decades, we have seen indications that that could be probably perhaps possible. And if these private entities are coming from a system of full accountability and high level of openness, I think this will be possible. And for the past several decades, I guess the awareness has been rising in the developmental efforts being made on that front, that private sector players should increasingly take over the role of leading and supporting development, and then the government should, if possible, take a backseat as much as possible. I think I will not disagree. I do not disagree with that kind of view, and in that regard, increased role of private sector players like NGOs and corporations that are focused on social responsibility and so on. I think they could be, in fact, quite a promising actors in within this dynamics.
Wouldn't that be more today's approach? As you said, NGO intervenes in some of the developing countries, where Korea had no support by NGOs at that time, and government could take an action. But today's in developing countries, NGO could more have a approach to the rural area, encouraging the village leaders, and would that be more today's?
Absolutely, because as far as I remember, when Sema movement, for instance, was going on, and then when Park leadership was in place, at that time, I think NGO was a name that was a little bit foreign to many people. Of course, we had missionaries and some of the international organizations that were active in helping us in the rural areas in the process of packaging movement and so on. But largely speaking, at that time, we did not have as many entities today known as NGOs. So NGO is a new thing, and definitely could be an innovation, and we have seen many kinds of potentials for this NGO movement. So yes, indeed, why not? In our time, as long as we have assurance that NGOs can deliver better results than the government, we should definitely seek such effort. And I do indeed believe, because of the changes in the situation, NGO rather than government could be more value creating for those countries that are in the need for development altogether.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Arnold asked, what were the failures of the Sema movement that developing countries should avoid if they want to engage in such rural development movement?
Partly because it was the Park's era, and because of that, possibly information of things going wrong may have been suppressed. Maybe not. There's no way we can know it, but for sure we don't have. Probably it's the time when we could not expect anything like a full closure and full accountability. So my point here is that there's no way of us knowing problems with Sema movement, especially failing in these localities. There's no assurance that we actually know the facts. But I would say we can pretty much guess when kind of like uh, money without any condition, any kind of much of too much of specific conditions attached. Of course, these were conditional assistance, and in that sense, it made a difference because if you continue to succeed, we'll continue to help you and all that kind of stuff. But other than that, it left much of the initiative to the people deciding what they need, what they'll do with this stuff. So in that sense, they kind of open-ended, more flexible
Mhm.
approach to helping, uh, particularly rural areas, being, left behind. I think it could probably make an intended difference uh,
Mhm.
by helping people do what they think is most necessary rather than
Mhm.
central government dictating everything. We know during the Soviet Union's time,
Mhm.
the problem with the central planning was they got into too many of the details. And even though they were trying to leave as much room for own decision making and autonomy and so on, they largely were kept as a experimental size or partial in terms of size. And so the open-endedness and the flexibility with not many of the dictations attached to, I think possibly could be a important condition for success, I think.
Mhm. Well noted, Professor. I have a question for Model 8 now. In today's developing country, do you think leading a country to sustainable development with two-way interaction of bottom-up and top-down mobilization is possible where it is difficult to bring collective action?
Yes, indeed. Especially when countries divided by individualism and an interest for specific communities that could actually ask for sacrifice of national interest.
Mhm.
I think the challenge would be more considerable. And in that sense, the two-way interaction of the bottom-up leadership and then top-down leadership and then bottom-up demand. Uh, I guess we need good combination of the both, and the national leadership should set the right kind of discourse to discuss what's better idea. Do we need to choose to seek things that will serve national interest better, or do we have to focus on the need and complaints and problems of local communities? I think we should keep a proper balance there.
Mhm.
Korea's experience during our time was that because nation was so mobilized for the cause of industrialization and development, often some of the individual concerns and interests, such as human rights, for
Mhm.
instance,
Mhm.
and the workers' rights, they were asked to be set aside. And even when people were asking for the rights to directly elect their leadership during Park
Mhm.
Chung-hee's time, uh, often it was asked, such demand was set aside as some kind of misguided, misinformed view. But in our time, I think it's critical to keep right balance between the two. Ideas coming down, ideas going up, they should be made to create a virtuous cycle. And then
Mhm.
uh, through virtuous cycle, we can produce consensus, national consensus, and persuade individuals who will have to pay the price for the collective action.
Mhm.
Uh, it's a simple idea. For example,
Mhm.
in order to have a clean air, right? For instance,
Mhm.
people who rely on coals at this time for heating their rooms and so on, and in their houses, they are often asked to try something else other than coals when coal is the cheapest resource to purchase. And then these people will have to pay higher price, and they pay higher price, so they make a sacrifice. But uh, country as a whole benefits because there will be less emission from the coal burning, right? So cost on small number of people, while benefits for a larger number of people. This is critical case of collective action, and the dilemma of collective action is there because you have to ask for sacrifice of small group for the cause of the interest of the nation as a whole. So always that kind of delicate and difficult and challenging balancing is always there. But the key is discourse, discussion, open discussion, honest discussion, talking about what it is that the country as a whole needs and people as a whole need. And when the ideas are laid out clearly, it will become much easier to persuade those small groups that will have to pay the price for the greater benefit of the collective as a whole. So that kind of mechanism, in my own view, is very, very important.
Okay, thank you. Professor, when those in Korea's case, when those village leaders corrupted, possibly, could the leaders could the collective actions built in the village level go into the national? Was bottom to top possible? And how
Of
could we
course
solve
not.
this issue?
Yeah, of course not. And after the democratization and then industrialization here in Korea, we have seen more cases of some of the village leaders who were not necessarily corrupt, but who were more focused on specific individual gains for the community as a whole, blocking national projects. For instance, let's say we want to build high-speed train here in this country, and the villages where the high-speed train railway needs to be built through, then these village leaders would organize big protest and ask for huge compensation from the government. Is there a corruption? I don't think that's corruption, but is it selfishness and motivation to maximize the compensation? I guess there were such motivations or moves behind this national projects. Now I'm not just talking about building high speed trains, but airport, for instance, expanding airport, building certain ports and so on. We saw greater activism of the community leaders focusing on just the community interest, to maximize the compensation package that they get from the government. So in that case, it's not necessarily corrupt leaders, but very selfish and unproductive from the perspective of national agenda and national interest. That has become a big problem for Korea. And now we are saying that, to address those kind of problems, again, the same thing that I mentioned before, we need a better system of discourse, uh, consensus building, and discussion to determine what are the good things to do for the interest of the nation, not just for small community and so on. So while we provide at the same time reasonable level of compensation, we no longer talk about sacrifice here. I mean, after the economic development, now government has enough resources to offer proper level of compensation for those people who are making sacrifices. But what the sizes of compensation should be, that's always actively debated. And every time, what we are saying is we need a proper channel, proper system in which we can talk about these issues and build consensus for reasonable level of compensation. Therefore, proper ways of buying support for the national agenda and national cause.
Well noted, Professor. Related to your comments, Arnold asked how Korea could manage these issues, serving the general interest rather than their own individual interest.
Uh, I guess Korea has been facing many such problems over the past several decades, let's say for the last 20, 30 decades. And we have been finding our ways to uh, better function and operate in terms of discerning the national interest above specific sectoral or
Mhm.
local interest, and and coming up with the reasonable level of consensus on how big the compensation should be. Uh, Pessimist feels that we have failed a lot for about 3 decades in doing this properly, but optimists, however, say that over time, through the experience, we have been building our experience and then building better ideas about how to deal with and resolve differences in this kind of challenging cases. So I would say in these cases, I don't think Korea has achieved a big success, but I think
Mhm.
Korea has indeed built uh, good foundation upon which we can do a better job, hopefully, as we move forward here. So I guess that's all we can say at this moment.
Mm. Okay. Could you recommend some kind of institutional mechanism in sustainable development perspective?
Institutional mechanism, uh, I guess, a strong system of national discussion. For instance, Korea's case, media's role has
Mm.
been traditionally very important.
Mm.
And Korean media has a long history of activism, even before the time of Japanese colonialization. And during the colonialization, they argue they've done a lot of work in terms of seeking the independence. I guess a lot of people will agree that's the case. And particularly during the time of democratization, struggle for democratization, 70s, 80s, and so on, they played a big role. So a lot of people read a lot of people have read newspapers all along. Of course, that has a lot to do with the fact that Korea had a high ratio of literacy here. People
Mm.
can read and write. So, for the past, I would say, about a century or more, Koreans have shared this kind of public discussion rather actively through the media. First with the printed media, then after that, for the past several decades, I guess other kinds of media have become um, pretty active. And of course, Korea of our time has a lot of problem with the media because media has become very powerful political group themselves, according to some of the critics. So we need to deal with the problem of media acting as a political force. That's a new kind of challenge. But before that, before getting to that point, we did have a, if you called it institutional design, but I would call it just a national system of a very proactive and an active media that has been, generating national discussions on important issues. And we discussed the Park Chung-hee's time before in today's session, but even Park Chung-hee's time, the Korean media was very active discussing economic issues. When Park government introduced a new tax systems, introduced new, economic policies and so on, Korean media was very active discussing pluses and minuses, pros and cons, and so on. So uh, overall, media as a venue and channel for national consensus building, I guess, has been all along pretty important for Korea.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think it was very learning, and Sim's Korean's case is very unique development case, but I believe it's applicable in other countries looking into the similarity as well.
Right.
And as the time's up, we will wrap up with this session. Thank you very much again, Professor. And if you would like to close short with a brief comment.
Uh, yeah, I guess same point as I shared with you last time when I had this live session. I greatly appreciate those people from around the world who have joined this session with great interest in Korea, Korea's experience, and I really want to strongly encourage you to look further into the details of Korea's experience. And Korea's experience is not supposed to offer panacea for everybody. And Koreans themselves, ourselves, are not completely happy with our own experience in its entirety, meaning that there are pluses and minuses, and some things that we did right, some things we did wrong. So keeping in mind this sense of balance, still Korea offers of a lot of stuff from which you can discern and sort out some of the positive things. So I want to encourage you to continue to look into the Korea case and discover yourself some of the useful things on your own. But also perhaps with the with the help through this kind of MOOC system as well.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for your participation, all the watchers. And we'll upload this video on the MOOC course online, and so that everyone can see. And thank you again, Professor. And we'll talk more about it on online discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.